I never expected my calling to lead me here, not to this forsaken place, perched on the edge of the world, where the wind never truly rests and the shadows clutch tighter than any earthly hand. My name is Father Elias, though it feels less like a name and more like a shackle these days. The church where I serve isn't one you'll find on any map, nor will it appear in any guidebook of holy places. It's ancient, built from cold stones that hum faintly beneath your feet, as if whispering secrets only the lost dare to hear. Tonight the sky is a heavy iron dome, swollen with clouds that press down like a suffocating weight. The wind howls around the spires, rattling the stained glass windows and carrying with it the faintest scent of decay. The air inside the chapel is thick, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere resists my breath. I light a candle near the altar, its fragile flame flickering against the oppressive gloom. The dim glow casts grotesque shadows across the walls, elongating the shapes of crucifixes and holy relics until they twist into forms barely recognizable, shapes that watch silently from the dark corners. It is past midnight, the hour when the veil between worlds grows thin, and my work begins. I do not baptize the innocent here. No, the souls that come to me are burdened, bound by curses and darkness beyond human reckoning. They are not saved by my ritual. They are contained, shackled by the sacred waters, so that their torment does not spill over into the world. This sanctuary, this crypt of faith and despair, is a prison for the damned. The stone floor beneath me is cold, biting into my knees as I kneel to prepare the holy water. My fingers tremble slightly, an involuntary tremor I have tried to suppress for years. The ritual never grows easier, and neither does the sight of those who come here seeking baptism. Their eyes are hollow, yet burning with the fire no human should bear. They carry the weight of suffering that no prayer can lift, the stench of death clinging to their skin. I can feel the presence of something else tonight, something ancient and watching, lurking just beyond the flicker of candlelight. The silence is not empty. It hums, vibrates, as though the church itself breathes with anticipation, readying for the next soul to arrive. The scent of damp earth and old wood mixes with something more sinister, an acrid tang that sets my nerves on edge. I try to steady my breath, repeating prayers silently, though the words feel hollow against the growing dread that coils in my chest. This is not a place of salvation. It is a threshold, a crossroads where hope goes to die and suffering takes a new form. I am the priest who baptizes the damned. The ritual never ends, and neither does the suffering. The knocking came just as the church clock tolled 1, slow, deliberate, echoing hollowly against the cold stone walls. It wasn't urgent, but it carried a weight, a summons neither I nor this place could ignore. I rose from the altar, the candle's flame guttering as the draft slipped through the heavy oak door. The air outside was colder than I expected, and the night pressed in close, filled with unseen eyes and distant, muted howls. I opened the door to find him standing there, a man, or what once was. His clothes hung in tatters, soaked with grime and what I can only guess was old blood. His skin, pale and slick, almost translucent, stretched tight over his gaunt frame, revealing bones that seemed too fragile to hold him upright. His eyes were the worst, black voids rimmed with flickers of fevered light, desperate but resigned, like a candle flickering in a storm. He didn't speak, didn't plead. His lips parted as if to say something, but only silence escaped. The faint sound of his ragged breathing, wheezing and uneven, filled the space between us. I stepped aside and motioned for him to enter, my hands steady but my heart pounding beneath the worn fabric of my cassock. The ritual was about to begin. Inside the chapel, the candlelight seemed to recoil, shadows deepening unnaturally around his form. The air grew colder, the weight of the silence thickening into a palpable presence. I guided him to the baptismal font, its waters black as obsidian in the dim light. As I prepared the holy oil and sprinkled the water, I could feel a tremor ripple through the stillness, as if the very elements hesitated at this unholy moment. The first words of the baptism prayer left my lips, trembling. His gaze never wavered, locked on some unseen horizon beyond the church walls. When I immersed him briefly in the water, a sound broke the silence, a low, guttural moan, not quite human, rasping from deep within his chest. The water rippled violently, sending cold droplets across the stone floor like frozen tears. I felt a sudden chill crawl up my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. There was a crackle in the air, a static charge that prickled my skin. The candles flickered wildly, then steadied again, casting the chapel in a flickering, otherworldly glow. The man's body trembled, but not from cold. It was as if something inside him resisted the ritual, struggling against the sanctity that should have brought relief. I finished the prayer, voice low and urgent now, almost pleading with the unseen powers to accept this soul, to bind it, to hold it back from whatever darkness threatened to break free. But in the depths of my being, I knew this baptism was not a cleansing. It was a cage, and the bars were forged from ancient suffering and endless torment. As I stepped back, my hands shaking, the man's eyes briefly flared with something terrible, rage, despair, or perhaps a warning. Then he slumped forward, body slackening as the ritual sealed his fate. The silence returned, heavier than before, and with it the terrible knowledge that this was only the beginning. The chapel fell into a silence so complete it seemed almost unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders, heavier than the stones overhead. The man, if I could still call him that, was motionless in the font, the water's surface perfectly still again, as if nothing had stirred in its depths. But I knew better. The stillness was a fragile veil over something far darker. I wiped the cold sweat from my brow and looked around the dimly lit room. Shadows clung to every corner, and the faint scent of damp earth and something metallic lingered in the air. I felt it then, an overwhelming sense of isolation. Not just physical isolation in this remote church, but a loneliness born of my task. This baptism, this binding, was mine alone to bear. Each soul chained here was a silent accusation, a reminder that the ritual never truly ends. Neither does the suffering. As I gathered my vestments and the remnants of the ritual, my hands trembled despite my best efforts. The memory of his gaze haunted me, the flicker of something unholy, a flash of rage or sorrow I couldn't decipher. I questioned what I had done. Was this mercy or condemnation? The lines blurred too easily here. The holy words I spoke felt hollow, rehearsed like a prayer repeated out of habit rather than conviction. I moved toward the altar, the candle's flicker casting a pale light over the worn scriptures and relics. I reached out to touch the pages, seeking solace in the familiar, but the words seemed distant and meaningless. How could I reconcile faith with this endless procession of damned souls? My prayers felt like whispers lost in a storm. A gnawing doubt crept into my mind. Was I the savior or merely a jailer? Was the ritual a divine act or a cruel sentence passed down through ages? The sanctuary that once offered comfort now felt like a trap. The church itself seemed alive, a living beast feeding off the pain and despair it housed. I sank onto a cold wooden pew, my breath shallow, heartbeat loud in the stillness. Memories flashed unbidden, faces of those I had baptized before, their silent screams echoing in my mind. Their suffering was not distant. It clung to me, invisible but tangible, like a second skin. I was part of this cycle, a link in an unbreakable chain of torment. Sleep would not come easily tonight, nor would peace. The echoes of the baptism would haunt me, whispered warnings carried on the night wind. I could feel the church watching, waiting for the next soul to arrive and the next ritual to begin. And I would be here, trapped within these walls, the priest who baptizes the damned. The ritual never ends, neither does the suffering, and neither will I. The dawn outside the chapel is a reluctant thing, barely pushing back the darkness that clings stubbornly to the edges of the world. The sky is a bruised purple, heavy with low clouds that promise rain, but the air inside the church remains stubbornly cold, an eternal chill that no fire or candle seems able to chase away. I watch the flickering flames dance along the altar as I prepare for the day's grim work, the familiar weight of my cassock heavy on my shoulders. The chapel feels different this morning, though, not in any way I can explain clearly, more like a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the air itself is holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to step through the heavy wooden doors. The silence is thicker, the shadows deeper, as if the walls are closing in just a little more than usual. I've come to expect this, to live with it like a constant companion. This place, this sacred prison, has its own heartbeat, a slow, steady pulse of something ancient and terrible. It hums beneath the stones, beneath the prayers, beneath my very skin. It is patient, waiting for the next soul to arrive, and I am its instrument. Todo. He priest bound by duty and despair to perform the baptism that seals the damned's fate. The church clock strikes 7, its chimes muffled and hollow in the heavy air. I glance toward the door, anticipating the inevitable arrival. The road that leads here is long and winding, hidden by dense forests and forgotten by the outside world. No one stumbles here by accident. Every soul who arrives bears the mark of torment, lost between life and death, condemned beyond hope. I prepare the baptismal font once more, the water inside shimmering faintly in the low light. This water is no ordinary sacrament. It is consecrated and cursed, infused with prayers and bindings older than the church itself. I dip my fingers in and let the coldness bite into my skin, a small reminder of the burden I carry. There is no cleansing here, only containment, only suffering. The wind picks up outside, rattling the windows and carrying with it the faintest trace of something unholy. I shiver despite the layers of fabric wrapped around me, a feeling crawling along my spine that I know all too well. The next soul will arrive soon, and the ritual will begin again. The church waits, I wait, and somewhere beyond these stone walls, something watches. The heavy knock came again, sharper this time, echoing through the hollow silence of the chapel like a summons I could neither ignore nor welcome. I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Standing there was a figure I had come to recognize, a presence both pitiful and terrifying. He was smaller than the last soul I baptized, his body trembling, skin pallid and clammy as if soaked in water but never truly dry. His eyes, wide and glassy, held the weight of unspeakable sorrow, flickering with flickers of confusion and dread. He didn't speak a word, but his gaze pierced through me, searching, or perhaps pleading, for some form of mercy I feared I could not grant. I stepped aside and motioned him in. The chill that followed was immediate, a biting cold that settled in my bones and refused to relent. The chapel, already a place of shadow and silence, seemed to grow darker, as if the very light was retreating before this new arrival. The candles flickered, casting grotesque shadows that danced mockingly across the cracked walls. I led him to the baptismal font, its dark waters swirling faintly, disturbed by unseen currents. As I prepared the ritual, the air thickened with a tension so dense I felt as though it might snap like a taut wire. The familiar words of the baptism prayer trembled on my lips, their sacred cadence struggling against the oppressive unease that hung over the room. When I immersed him, even briefly, the water hissed softly, as if scalded by contact with the damned. A low moan escaped his lips, a sound raw and ragged, not quite human. His body stiffened, trembling violently as though battling some unseen force within. I could feel it too, a resistance, a dark will struggling against the bindings I was trying to impose. The scent of earth and decay grew stronger, mingling with the cold dampness of the chapel. My skin prickled, every nerve screaming in warning. The shadows around us thickened, the candle flames sputtering as if gasping for breath. His eyes flashed, briefly blazing with a terrible light, a mixture of rage and despair that froze me in place. I finished the prayer with urgency, my voice cracking as I pleaded for divine mercy on a soul clearly beyond saving. Yet even as the last words left my mouth, I knew this baptism was not absolution. It was a chain, a curse, a cage forged from suffering and bound by ancient rites. When the ritual ended, he slumped forward, exhausted and broken, but the terror lingered in the air like a stain. I was left with the heavy silence and the unshakable feeling that the darkness was far from finished with us. The moment the ritual concluded, a heavy silence settled over the chapel, one that felt as suffocating as the damp stone walls themselves. The air was thick with something unspoken, a weight pressing down on my chest that no prayer could lift. The man I had baptized sat slumped near the font, his breathing shallow and ragged, yet his eyes held that same distant, haunted look that had first drawn me into this place. I stepped back, trying to steady my trembling hands, but the chill inside me only deepened. My mind reeled with the magnitude of what I'd just done, or perhaps failed to do. This was no salvation, no cleansing of sins or redemption. It was a binding, a cruel sentence carved from ancient rites and worn prayers. Each baptism felt like another link forged in a chain I could neither see nor break, and I was the unwilling blacksmith hammering at the eternal iron. I looked around the chapel, at the flickering candles whose light seemed to struggle against the encroaching darkness. The shadows writhed, almost alive, as if they whispered secrets meant only for me. The faint scent of damp earth lingered, mixed with something acrid and sharp that set my nerves on edge. I swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness settling on my tongue. Memories of those who had come before flickered through my mind, the faces etched with agony, the silent screams locked behind hollow eyes. Their pain was a constant companion, a ghost I carried beneath my skin. I wondered, not for the first time, if I was still human beneath the cassock, or just a vessel for this relentless suffering. Faith, once a fortress, felt fragile and cracked. The prayers I recited sounded empty, hollow echoes against the vast emptiness that stretched between me and whatever salvation I had once believed in. Doubt clawed at me, insidious and relentless. Was I a priest of God, or a servant to something darker, a keeper of souls, or a warden of endless torment? The days here lose all meaning. Time slips through my fingers like dry dust, scattered by a wind I cannot see but always feel. The church remains a tomb, its heavy stone walls swallowing light and hope alike. Outside, the world moves on, oblivious to the endless cycle within these walls. But here, the air remains thick and cold, as though the earth itself resists life. This morning, the chapel is wrapped in a thick mist that seeps through the cracked windows, curling around the pews and altar like spectral fingers. The faint scent of mildew and damp stone rises from the floorboards, mixing with the sharper, more disturbing odors that linger after each baptism. It is a smell I have come to associate with despair, something almost alive, clinging stubbornly to the shadows. The ritual tools are laid out meticulously, as they always are. The baptismal font sits at the center of the chapel, its waters dark and still, concealing the secrets it holds. I touch the rim of the basin, feeling the cold bite through my skin, a coldness that seems to reach beyond the physical, settling deep into my bones. The font is no longer just a vessel for water, it has become a symbol of the prison I maintain, the endless chain that binds the damned. My robes rustle softly as I move, each step echoing hollowly against the stone floor. The flickering candlelight casts long, wavering shadows that crawl across the walls, distorting the familiar symbols of faith into something alien, almost sinister. I find myself glancing nervously at the dark corners where the shadows pool thickly, as if hiding secrets too terrible to name. The stillness is broken only by the faint, distant tolling of the church bell, its sound muffled and warped as though carried from another place entirely. It reminds me that time still moves, even here, even in this forsaken place. But for me, it is marked not by our days, but by the arrival of the next soul, another lost spirit to be baptized, bound, and condemned. I prepare the water once again, the surface reflecting the dim light like a dark mirror. Each baptism deepens the stain on my soul, each ritual a thread tightening around my own freedom. The knowledge that I will perform this ceremony again and again sits heavy in my mind, a weight I can neither lift nor escape. Outside, the wind rises, rattling the windows and stirring the fog into restless swirls. Somewhere beyond the chapel's walls, the forest waits, silent and watchful. And I wait too, caught in this endless limbo, the priest who baptizes the damned. The heavy ancient door groaned open again before the first bell had fully faded into silence. The figure who stepped inside was unlike the others, more elusive, more broken in ways I could not yet name. He moved with a tremulous hesitation, as if his very bones fought against carrying him forward. His face was obscured by shadows, but the faint flicker of candlelight caught the pale sheen of damp skin stretched tight across sharp cheekbones. His eyes, when they found mine, held a flicker of something deeper than fear, something like guilt or regret. There was a silence between us, thick and oppressive, as if the air itself awaited what was to come with bated breath. The chapel felt colder still, the flickering flames struggling to keep the darkness at bay. The scent of damp earth mingled with an acrid tang, sharp and unsettling, that I had come to associate with these baptisms. I guided him toward the baptismal font, the steps echoing hollowly against the stone. The water shimmered darkly in the candlelight, almost as if it were alive, waiting. I dipped my fingers into the surface and felt the familiar cold bite against my skin. But this time, beneath that chill was something else, an electric tension that prickled at my nerves. As I began the prayers, the air thickened until it felt suffocating, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. His breath was shallow and uneven, a soft, rasping sound that seemed to echo unnervingly in the confined space. When I lowered him briefly into the water, a sharp, unnatural cry tore from his throat, neither fully human nor beast. It was raw agony, a sound that reverberated through the chapel's bones. The water churned violently as if resisting the baptism, sending icy droplets splattering against the stone floor. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed along the walls. I could feel a pulse beneath the surface of the font, a rhythmic thudding that seemed to beat in time with my own heart. His body convulsed, fighting against whatever unseen force I was trying to impose. A low, guttural growl vibrated from deep within his chest, a sound of rage and despair intertwined. For a moment, his eyes blazed with an unholy light that froze me in place, filled with a warning I dared not ignore. The final words of the prayer fell from my lips with desperation and trembling urgency, a plea to whatever powers governed this cursed place to accept this soul and keep the darkness confined. But I knew with bitter clarity that this baptism was not an act of salvation. It was a sentence, a binding that would trap him in a torment from which there was no reprieve. As the water stilled, he slumped forward, broken and hollowed, the terrible light in his eyes dimming to a dull ember. The oppressive silence returned, but it was heavier now, laden with the knowledge that this ritual was just one more link in an unending chain of suffering. The chapel was swallowed by silence once more, but it was a different silence than before, heavier, denser, as if the very air held its breath, mourning along with me. I stood there watching the figure I had just baptized slump near the font, his body drained of strength, yet his presence remained a shadowy weight in the room. The water's surface rippled faintly, a quiet reminder of the unseen forces trapped beneath. A coldness settled deep in my chest, spreading through my limbs like a slow poison. It was a physical ache, but also something far more insidious, a gnawing at my soul that no prayer or ritual could soothe. Each baptism feels like another stone added to this unyielding burden I carry, a burden not of my choosing, but one I cannot cast off. I moved away from the font, hands trembling slightly as I sought something, anything that might anchor me to this reality. My eyes fell on the worn altar, the faded scriptures splayed open like silent witnesses to the endless cycle of torment I am trapped within. The words seemed distant, as if I were reading them from beneath water, their meaning slipping through my grasp. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the nature of salvation, even my own faith. Was I a priest serving God or a jailer bound to an eternal curse? The thought clawed at me relentlessly, a poison that seeped into my waking hours and haunted my dreams. The souls I baptized were not freed. They were bound tighter, trapped in a liminal space between suffering and oblivion, and I was the one who cast the chains. I sank onto a cold pew, my breath shallow, the silence pressing in around me. The chapel seemed to pulse with unseen life, the faint rustle of shadows shifting, the distant drip of water echoing like a countdown. The scent of damp earth and something acrid lingered, a constant reminder that this place is no sanctuary but a prison. Memories flickered unbidden, the faces of the damned, their hollow eyes and silent screams etched into my mind. Their pain clings to me, an invisible shroud that grows heavier with each passing day. Sometimes I wonder if the suffering is mine now, if the ritual has woven our fates together so tightly that there is no escape. Sleep offers no refuge. The nightmares come, visions of twisting shadows, anguished cries carried on the wind, and the endless procession of souls trapped in a cycle that never breaks. I wake drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding, the weight of the church pressing down on me even in darkness. Yet despite the despair, the ritual calls me back. The next soul will come, the chain will tighten, and I will be here, the priest who baptizes the damned, trapped in a cycle where the ritual never ends, and neither does the suffering. The air inside the chapel grew heavier with each passing day, a thick fog of despair settling over everything like a choking shroud. I can feel it pressing down on my chest as I move through the dim halls, the faint echoes of footsteps long past reverberating beneath my boots. The stone walls seem to breathe, exhaling cold whispers that seep into the cracks and crevices, wrapping themselves around me like chains. Today, as always, I find myself drawn to the baptismal font, the cold water gleaming darkly beneath the flickering candlelight. Its surface is unnervingly still, yet I can sense the restless torment lying beneath, like a storm barely contained. The font has become more than a vessel. It is a scar on this cursed place, a symbol of the pain inflicted and endured. I reach out, tracing the rim with trembling fingers, feeling the biting chill that seeps deep into my bones. The church around me seems to close in tighter, the shadows thickening in the corners where the dim light fails to reach. Symbols of faith, crosses, faded frescoes, and weathered statues hang in the half-light, twisted by time and neglect into grotesque parodies of hope. The silence here is suffocating, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere beneath the floorboards and the faint rustle of unseen things stirring just beyond sight. Outside, the wind howls through, the skeletal trees carrying with it a cold, acrid scent that lingers like a warning. Today, I notice new markings etched into the walls near the font, symbols I do not recognize, scorched and jagged, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. They seem alive, pulsing with a silent menace. I trace them carefully, the skin on my fingertips prickling with unease. These marks are not new to the church, but their sudden brightness fills me with a dread I cannot name. My reflection shimmers faintly in the water's surface, gaunt and weary, eyes sunken yet burning with a hollow fire. The weight of what I do, what I have become, weighs on me like a leaden cloak. The souls I baptize carry marks now, symbols branded into their flesh during the ritual, visible signs of their cursed state. I wonder if these marks are meant to warn others, or if they are part of the chains that bind them. The church no longer feels like a sanctuary. It is a prison, and I am both its warden and its prisoner. The line between salvation and damnation blurs here, twisted by ancient rites and forgotten prayers. I am trapped in a role I never chose, forced to bear witness to suffering I cannot end. The candlelight flickers, casting shifting shadows that seem to reach out with clawed fingers. The silence tightens around me, a living thing hungry for the next soul, the next baptism, the next chapter in this unending nightmare. The door creaked open with an ominous groan, breaking the stifling silence like a sudden crack in fragile glass. I turned to see the latest soul step inside, their presence folding into the cold chapel like a shadow stretching across stone. This one was different, worn not just by time but by something deeper, something that clawed at the edges of their being. Their skin was marked with strange, jagged scars, faintly glowing in the flickering candlelight. I had seen such marks before, branded into the flesh of those who'd come before them. The marks burned not only on the body but seemed to etch themselves onto their very souls. The air grew thick with the acrid scent of burnt flesh and something far older, something that whispered in a language older than prayer. Their eyes, sunken and wild, darted nervously as if trying to escape unseen horrors lurking just beyond my sight. There was a hesitation in their step, a flicker of resistance, yet they moved forward, drawn by the inevitability of this place and the ritual I was bound to perform. I guided them to the baptismal font, whose dark waters shimmered faintly, reflecting the wavering candlelight like a pool of ink. My hands trembled slightly as I prepared the ritual, the familiar litany of prayers heavy on my tongue. But tonight the words felt brittle, fragile, like shards of glass that could shatter with the slightest breath. As I lowered them into the water, a sharp intake of breath escaped their lips, quickly followed by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the chapel's stone walls. The water churned violently, ripples crashing against the font's edge as if fighting to reject this intrusion. A sudden cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing several candles at once and plunging us into near darkness. Shadows writhed unnaturally, twisting into forms that danced mockingly just beyond the candlelight's reach. I felt an oppressive weight settle upon my chest, making each breath a struggle. Their body convulsed violently, muscles straining against some invisible tether. A scream, a wordless, soul-wrenching howl, ripped from deep within them, filling the air with raw anguish. Their eyes blazed with an unholy fire, locking onto mine with a mixture of fury, and pleading. I pressed onward with the prayer, voice breaking under the weight of desperation, begging whatever power governed this cursed place to hold this soul in its place, to contain the darkness that threatened to spill free. As the water stilled and their body went limp, I dared a glance at their hands. Etched deep into their pale skin were the jagged symbols, glowing faintly like burning embers. The mark of the cursed, the bond of torment. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, knowing that the ritual was not a salvation, but a sentence. That this soul, like so many before, was chained now, trapped within this endless cycle of suffering, and I, the priest who baptizes the damned, was the one who bound them. The chapel's silence returned, but it felt different this time, thicker, heavier, like a weight settling into every corner of the room. The air was thick with the remnants of the ritual, the acrid tang of burnt flesh still lingering faintly, mingling with the damp, musty scent of stone and old wood. I stood alone by the baptismal font, my hands trembling slightly, though I tried to steady them against the cold stone rim. The figure I had baptized earlier lay slumped near the edge of the font, their body limp but their presence still a heavy burden in the room. Their eyes, once wild with a flicker of resistance, were now dull and distant, yet I could sense the unrest simmering beneath the surface, a storm that no blessing could quell. I tried to tell myself this was mercy, that I was sparing them from worse horrors, but the truth is far darker. Each baptism binds these souls tighter, chaining them in an unending cycle of torment from which there is no escape. I am the priest who seals that fate, and the weight of it crushes me more with each passing day. As I moved away from the font, the flickering candlelight cast long shadows that seemed to crawl and twist, reaching out like grasping fingers desperate to pull me back into the darkness. The walls, etched with ancient symbols, and now glowing faintly in places, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a reminder that this church is not just a building, but a living prison. My thoughts spiraled as I sank onto a cold pew, exhaustion wrapping around me like a shroud. The faces of those I had baptized haunted me, their hollow eyes, the silent screams, the unbearable weight of their suffering. It clings to me, invisible but suffocating, an ever-present reminder of my role in this endless nightmare. Faith, once my refuge, now feels fragile and frayed. The prayers I recite sound hollow, echoes lost in a cavern of doubt and despair. I question everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the nature of salvation, the very existence of mercy. Am I a servant of God or merely a warden of torment? Sleep is a stranger I cannot find. The nightmares come unbidden, visions of twisted shadows, anguished cries, and the endless procession of souls trapped in limbo. I wake drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the weight of the church pressing down on me even in the darkness. Yet, despite the despair, I remain bound to this place, to the ritual, to the suffering. The cycle never ends, the ritual never ends, and neither does the suffering, and neither will I. The morning light filters weakly through the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of color across the cold stone floor. The chapel seems suspended in a perpetual twilight, caught between the fading night and a reluctant dawn. I sit alone at the altar, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the ancient Bible, its pages soft with age but heavy with forgotten prayers. The air is thick, still carrying the weight of the night's ritual. Like a shroud, the scent of burning candles mingles with the damp, earthy smell of the old church. Outside, the wind rustles through the gnarled branches of the ancient trees that surround this place, their skeletal forms scratching at the fog like desperate fingers reaching for salvation. I wear the cassock as both armor and shackle, the fabric heavy with the knowledge of what must come. Each morning I prepare myself for the inevitable, the arrival of another soul, broken and burdened, seeking baptism not as a path to redemption, but as a binding to torment. The ritual never changes, but the weight it carries grows heavier with every repetition. The baptismal font gleams in the dim light, its water unnaturally still and dark. I run my fingers along its rim, feeling the familiar chill seep into my skin. This is no ordinary water. It carries the prayers and curses of centuries, a mixture of sanctity and despair that binds the damned to their fates. The chapel walls seem to close in tighter today. The shadows stretch longer, flickering in the candlelight like restless spirits dancing just out of reach. I glance at the faded frescoes and cracked statues that line the walls, holy symbols twisted by time and neglect into something almost sinister. They watch me silently, bearing witness to the endless cycle I am trapped within. A distant bell tolls, its sound muffled and haunting, marking the passage of time that feels both eternal and meaningless here. I rise slowly, the weight of the day settling on my shoulders. I prepare the ritual tools with practiced hands, but my mind wanders, haunted by the faces of those I have baptized before, their hollow eyes, the silent screams trapped beneath their skin. The church waits. I wait. The ritual will begin again, the suffering will continue, and I will be here, bound to this place, the priest who baptizes the damned. The heavy knock echoed through the chapel, louder and more insistent than usual, slicing through the stillness like a blade. I opened the ancient door with a hand that trembled despite my effort to remain composed. Standing there was a figure, gaunt and trembling, shrouded in ragged clothes, damp with something I couldn't immediately identify. The weight of suffering hung around him like a second skin, and his eyes, those hollow, desperate eyes, locked onto mine with a silent plea I could not answer. He didn't speak. Words seemed useless here. Instead, his breath came ragged and uneven, a soft rasping sound that filled the space between us. I stepped aside, motioning him in, the cold air rushing out like a sigh as he crossed the threshold. The chapel seemed to grow colder still, the shadows deepening, swallowing the flickering candlelight in their embrace. As I guided him toward the baptismal font, the water rippled faintly, disturbed by an unseen force. The faint scent of damp earth and something acrid, like burnt flesh, wafted in the air. The weight of the moment settled heavily on me. This was no ordinary baptism. The ritual was a binding, a sentence. I prepared the sacred water and oil, my hands steady but my heart hammering against my ribs. The prayers fell from my lips, not with the certainty of faith but with the tremor of desperation. When I immersed him briefly, the water hissed softly, as if recoiling from the corruption it was meant to cleanse. A low, guttural moan escaped him, raw and unearthly, reverberating through the chapel like a distant echo of pain. His body tensed violently, convulsing against an invisible chain, a struggle not just physical, but spiritual. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed on the walls like restless spirits. His eyes flared with a terrible light, rage, sorrow, and something else I could not distinguish, all swirling in a terrifying storm. The final words of the ritual were a plea, a desperate cry to whatever power governed this cursed place, begging for mercy and containment. But I knew, deep down, this was not mercy, it was a cage. As the water stilled and his body slackened, I felt the crushing weight of the endless cycle. Another soul bound, another link forged in an unbreakable chain of torment. I was the priest who baptized the damned, and the ritual never ends. The heavy silence that followed the ritual was almost suffocating. The chapel seemed to absorb the sound, leaving nothing but the faint drip of water from a forgotten leak somewhere in the shadows. I stood near the baptismal font, my hands still trembling from the weight of what had just transpired. The air hung thick with the acrid scent of burnt flesh and damp stone, a stench that had become all too familiar, a constant reminder of the suffering embedded in these walls. The figure I had baptized earlier now sat slumped on the cold floor, his breathing shallow, eyes glazed with a distant emptiness. Yet beneath that hollow gaze, I sensed an unrest that no blessing could quiet. It was as if a storm raged beneath the surface, trapped and powerless, just like the souls who had come before him. I swallowed hard and turned away, the cold stone of the font biting into my palms as I gripped its edge. Doubt gnawed relentlessly at my mind. Was this ritual truly divine, or a cruel sentence disguised as salvation? Each baptism felt like another link in an unbreakable chain of torment, and I was the one forging the bonds. The chapel's shadows seemed to writhe and twist in the candlelight, taking on shapes that danced just beyond my vision. The ancient symbols carved into the walls pulsed faintly, their glow a sinister reminder that this place was alive with something far older and darker than faith. The way I saw bar had of it crushed me, threatening to break what little resolve I had left. I sank onto a wooden pew, exhaustion washing over me like a cold wave. Memories of the damned haunted my thoughts, their silent screams, the emptiness behind their eyes, the chains that bound them and now bound me as well. The suffering wasn't theirs alone anymore. It was mine, etched into my very soul. Faith, once a source of comfort, now felt fragile and hollow. The prayers I muttered were echoes lost in a vast void of despair. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the nature of mercy, and whether I was a servant of light or a warden of shadows. Sleep was no refuge. Nightmares came with unrelenting force, twisted faces, anguished cries, the endless procession of souls caught in limbo. I would awaken in cold sweats, heart pounding, the weight of this church pressing down even in the darkness. And yet the cycle continued. The ritual never ended, the suffering never ceased, and I remained, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The chapel feels heavier than ever today, as if the weight of every soul I've baptized presses down upon the very stones beneath my feet. The faint morning light filters weakly through the stained glass, casting fractured colors that do little to brighten the gloom. Outside, a cold mist clings stubbornly to the earth, winding through the twisted branches of the ancient trees like restless spirits refusing to move on. Inside, the air is thick with the familiar scents, burning wax, damp stone, and something darker, an acrid undertone that lingers like a wound, never allowed to heal. I sit silently by the altar, my fingers tracing the faded carvings worn smooth by centuries of prayer and despair. The words on the worn Bible before me seem distant, their meanings slipping away like water through my grasp. The baptismal font stands at the center of the chapel, its dark water unnervingly still, reflecting the flickering can. Light like a pool of ink. The chill radiating from it seeps deep into my bones, a reminder that this place is no sanctuary but a prison, both for those baptized and for me. I adjust my robes, feeling the fabric heavy and suffocating, like a shroud woven from the very sorrow that saturates this place. The faces of those who came before flash behind my eyes, their hollow, haunted eyes, their silent pleas trapped beneath layers of torment. Each arrival renews the cycle, and with it, my own descent into darkness. The chapel's shadows twist and stretch in the candlelight, grotesque shapes that seem to leer and whisper just beyond my vision. The ancient symbols etched into the walls glow faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat, an ominous reminder that the power binding these souls is alive, waiting, hungry. A distant bell tolls, its sound muffled and mournful, echoing through the cold air like a dirge. It marks the inevitable arrival, the next soul destined to walk through these doors, to be baptized not into salvation, but into chains. I rise slowly, the weight of the day settling heavily on my shoulders. The ritual tools lie ready, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I steel myself for what must come, even as the dread coils tighter in my gut. The chapel waits. I wait. The suffering will begin anew. The chapel door opened with a reluctant creak, shattering the heavy silence like a sharp breath exhaled in the dead of night. I turned to face the figure who stepped inside. Frail, trembling, cloaked in rags soaked through with the chill of the mist outside, their eyes, wide and hollow, flickered with a desperate kind of hope I knew I could not grant. No words passed between us. The unspoken gravity of what was to come hung thick in the air, wrapping itself around my chest like a vice. I stepped aside, motioning for the soul to enter fully, and as they crossed the threshold, the chapel seemed to grow colder, shadows lengthening and darkening around us. I guided them slowly toward the baptismal font, the dark waters shimmering faintly beneath the flickering candlelight. The scent of damp earth and something acrid like smoldering ash rose from the air, twisting my stomach with its sharp bitterness. The familiar chill seeped into my fingers as I touched the rim of the font, but beneath it was something new. An electric tension that prickled along my nerves, warning me of the darkness that waited. The prayers began, my voice low and unsteady, carrying words I no longer believed in but was bound to speak. When I dipped the figure briefly into the water, a guttural cry tore from their lips, raw and animalistic, echoing off the stone walls. The water roiled violently, splashing against the floor as if rejecting the baptism itself. Their body convulsed, muscles twitching as if fighting against invisible chains. The candle flames flickered and sputtered, casting grotesque shadows that writhed along the cracked walls. Their eyes burned with a terrible light, rage, sorrow, and something primal all mixed into a blazing storm that held me captive. The final words of the ritual left my lips with desperate urgency, a plea to whatever power held sway here to accept this soul and bind the darkness within. But deep down, I knew the truth. This was no salvation. It was a sentence, a chain, another link forged in the unending cycle of torment. As the water stilled and the figure sagged, drained and hollow, the oppressive silence returned, heavier than before. The marks, jagged symbols glowing faintly on their pale skin, were the fin, al seal, the curse branded into flesh and soul. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, knowing this was my fate as much as theirs. The priest who baptizes the damned, trapped forever in a ritual that never ends. The chapel fell into a suffocating silence once the ritual ended, but this silence was heavier, thicker than any before. The acrid scent of burnt flesh lingered, mingling with the damp stone and faint traces of candle wax, creating an atmosphere thick with despair. I remained by the baptismal font, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the cold stone rim, trying to steady myself against the overwhelming weight of what had just transpired. The soul I had baptized lay collapsed nearby, a hollow shell drained of strength, yet I could feel the restless storm brewing just beneath the surface, an anguish that no ritual could calm. The vacant eyes stared past me, reflecting the endless torment that had become their existence. I turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer, but their suffering clung to me like a shadow, refusing to be shaken. My thoughts spiraled into a deep, suffocating abyss. Was this act truly a blessing or a cruel sentence disguised as mercy? Each baptism forged another link in an unbreakable chain of torment, and I, the priest entrusted with this duty, was the one who welded those chains, binding souls to their eternal suffering. The flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows that danced and twisted along the chapel walls, warping ancient symbols into grotesque parodies of hope. The faint glow from the etched markings pulsed faintly, as if alive, reminding me that this place was more than a church. It was a living prison. The realization crushed my spirit, weighing me down until I felt I might collapse beneath its burden. I sank onto a cold wooden pew, exhaustion washing over me like a wave of icy despair. Memories of the damned haunted me relentlessly. Their silent screams, the hollow emptiness in their eyes, the chains I had bound around them. The suffering was no longer theirs alone. It had become mine, etched into my very soul. Faith, once my refuge, now felt brittle and hollow. The prayers I whispered echoed in a void of doubt and despair. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the existence of mercy, and whether I was a servant of light or a warden of darkness. Sleep offered no respite. Nightmares clawed their way into my rest, twisted faces, anguished cries, endless processions of trapped souls. I would awaken drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the crushing weight of this church pressing down on me even in darkness. Yet despite the despair, the cycle continued. The ritual never ended. The suffering never ceased, and I remained, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The chapel feels colder than usual today, as if the very walls are drawing the chill deeper into their ancient stones. The first light of dawn struggles through the stained glass windows, casting fractured shards of muted color onto the cold floor. Outside, the wind howls through the twisted branches of the gnarled trees, their skeletal limbs scratching at the fog like desperate hands reaching out for salvation. Inside, the silence is thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint drip of water echoing somewhere beneath the floorboards. I sit quietly by the altar, hands resting on the worn wood, fingers tracing the faded carvings etched into the surface centuries ago. The weight of the countless prayers and curses that have passed through this place seems to press down on me like a shroud. The ancient Bible before me lies open but unread. The words swim before my eyes, blurred and meaningless, drowned beneath the fog of exhaustion and dread. The baptismal font stands at the center of the chapel, its water unnervingly still and dark, reflecting the flickering candlelight like a pool of black glass. I reach out hesitantly, feeling the cold seep into my skin and settle deep in my bones. This is no ordinary water. It carries the burden of every soul bound by this ritual, every curse cast and every prayer unanswered. It is a pool of despair, and I am its reluctant keeper. My robes feel heavier than ever, the fabric clinging to me like a shroud woven from the suffering of those I have baptized. The faces of the damned haunt my thoughts, their hollow eyes, their silent screams trapped beneath layers of torment. Each arrival renews the cycle. Each ritual tightens the chains, and I am trapped in the middle, a priest bound by duty and despair. The flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows on the walls, distorting the ancient symbols carved into the stone. They seem to leer and whisper just beyond the edge of vision, a constant reminder that this place is alive with something far older and darker than faith. The air is thick with the scent of burning wax, damp stone, and something acrid, like smoldering ash, a scent that lingers long after the candles have burned low. A distant bell tolls, its mournful chime echoing through the fog outside and the heavy silence inside. It marks the inevitable, the arrival of the next soul destined to walk through these doors, to be baptized not into salvation, but into chains. I rise slowly, the weight of the day settling heavily on my shoulders. The ritual tools lie ready, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I steel myself for what must come. The chapel waits. I wait. The cycle will begin anew. The chapel door creaked open with a slow, reluctant groan, disturbing the suffocating stillness that had settled like a heavy cloak over the ancient stones. A figure stepped inside, frail and trembling, their presence seeming to draw the cold deeper into the room. Wrapped in threadbare clothes, damp with the chill outside, their eyes flickered with a desperate hope I knew I could not fulfill. No words passed between us. The weight of what was to come hung thick in the air, wrapping itself around my chest like a tightening noose. I stepped aside, motioning for the soul to cross the threshold fully. As they entered, the shadows deepened, the flickering candlelight dimming as if reluctant to illuminate this cursed moment. Guiding them toward the baptismal font, I could feel the familiar chill seep through my gloves as my fingers brushed the cold stone rim. The water's surface shimmered with a dark sheen, reflecting the wavering flames and the haunted eyes that stared back at me from the depths. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and a sharp, acrid tang, like burnt offerings long past, lingering as a bitter reminder of this place's cursed history. The prayers began, my voice low and trembling. I repeated the ancient words, not with conviction but out of obligation, each syllable weighed down by the knowledge of what this ritual truly meant. When I submerged the figure briefly in the water, a guttural cry escaped, a raw, animalistic sound that echoed off the stone walls and reverberated through my chest. Their body convulsed violently, muscles twisting in a desperate struggle against invisible chains. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed like restless spirits along the cracked walls. Their eyes burned with a terrible light, a tempest of fury, sorrow, and something primal that froze me in place. I pressed on with the final words of the ritual, my voice breaking under the strain of desperate pleading. I begged whatever power held sway in this place to accept the soul and contain the darkness that threatened to spill free. But deep within, I knew the bitter truth. This was no salvation. It was a binding, a curse, another link forged in the endless chain of suffering. As the water stilled and the figure sagged, drained, and hollow, the oppressive silence returned, thicker, heavier than before. Faint, jagged symbols glowed softly on their pale skin, the final mark of the damned. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, knowing I was once again the priest who baptized the damned, trapped in a ritual that never ends. The chapel sank into a silence so profound it seemed almost tangible. The oppressive stillness weighed down on me, thicker and heavier than ever before. The faint scent of burnt wax mixed with the acrid odor of something long burned. an invisible stain left behind by the suffering that had just unfolded within these ancient walls. I stood by the baptismal font, my hands gripping its cold, unyielding stone edge, the tremor in my fingers betraying the turmoil roiling inside me. The figure I had baptized earlier now sat slumped against the far wall, a hollow shell emptied of life and hope. Their breathing was shallow, uneven, yet beneath the vacant gaze, I sensed a turbulent storm swirling, restless and unrelenting. No blessing could quell the tempest within, a torment that I, as the priest, had bound to them with my own hands. I turned away, unable to bear the sight any longer, but the weight of their suffering clung to me like a relentless shadow. The faces of the damned flashed unbidden through my mind, their empty eyes, silent screams, and the chains I forged with each baptism. This torment was no longer theirs alone. It was etched deep within my soul, a permanent scar I could neither erase nor escape. My thoughts spiraled into a pit of despair. Was this ritual truly sacred, or a cruel sentence masquerading as salvation? Each baptism was another link in an endless chain of suffering, and I was the blacksmith forging those bonds. The chapel's flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the walls, twisting the ancient symbols into sinister shapes that seemed to leer and whisper just beyond my sight. The faint glow from the etched markings pulsed with a life of its own, a grim reminder that this place was no mere church but a living prison for souls like theirs and mine. The crushing weight of this realization threatened to break me, and I sank onto a cold wooden pew, exhaustion sweeping over me like a cold wave. Memories haunted my restless mind. The faces of the damned, their silent pleas, the unbearable weight of their suffering. Faith, once my sanctuary, now felt fragile and hollow. The prayers I muttered were hollow echoes lost in an abyss of doubt. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the meaning of mercy, and whether I was a servant of light or a warden of darkness. Sleep remained elusive, invaded by nightmares, twisted faces, anguished cries, and endless processions of trapped souls. I would awaken drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the burden of this cursed church pressing down even in darkness. Yet, despite the despair, the cycle continued. The ritual never ended, the suffering never ceased, and I remained, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The chapel feels heavier this morning, as if the very stones have absorbed more despair overnight. Pale light filters through the stained glass windows, casting fragmented, muted colors across the cold floor. Outside, the wind rattles the skeletal branches of the ancient trees, their silhouettes clawing at the fog like desperate hands grasping for release. Inside, the silence is suffocating, broken only by the faint, irregular drip of water echoing somewhere beneath the floorboards. I sit alone near the altar, my fingers tracing the worn edges of the ancient Bible. The pages feel fragile, weighed down by centuries of prayers, curses, and forgotten voices. The words blur as exhaustion and dread cloud my mind, making it difficult to focus on anything beyond the oppressive atmosphere. The baptismal font stands at the center of the chapel, its dark water unnervingly still, reflecting the flickering candlelight like a pool of black glass. I reach out, feeling the cold seep into my skin, a chill that burrows deep into my bones. This is no ordinary water. It carries the burden of every soul bound by this cursed ritual, every curse whispered and every prayer left unanswered. My robes cling heavy and suffocating, soaked with the weight of those I have baptized. Their faces haunt my thoughts, their hollow eyes, silent screams, and the chains I have bound around them. Each arrival renews the cycle, and with it my own descent into darkness. The shadows flicker and twist in the candlelight, distorting the ancient symbols carved into the stone walls. They seem to leer and whisper just beyond my vision, reminders that this place is alive with something far older and darker than faith. The scent of burning wax mingles with the acrid smell of something scorched, an invisible stain left by countless rituals. A distant bell tolls, its mournful chime echoing through the fog outside and the heavy silence inside. It marks the inevitable, the arrival of the next soul destined to walk through these doors, to be baptized not into salvation, but into chains. I rise slowly, the weight of the day settling heavily on my shoulders. The ritual tools lie ready, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I steel myself for what must come. The chapel waits. I wait. The cycle will begin anew. The heavy door creaked open, breaking the uneasy silence with a sound that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. A figure stood there, thin, Gaunt, their ragged clothing soaked through with the damp chill that clung stubbornly to the morning air. Their eyes, wide and haunted, met mine with a flicker of desperate hope I knew I couldn't grant. No words passed between us. The weight of what was to come pressed down like a vice on my chest, constricting my breath. I stepped aside, silently beckoning the soul inside. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop further, the shadows deepening until they threatened to swallow the flickering candlelight whole. I led them slowly to the baptismal font. The water's surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the wavering flames and the hollow eyes that stared back at me from its depths. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something acrid, like smoldering ash and burnt flesh, the bitter remnants of countless rituals before this one. The prayers slipped from my lips, not with faith but out of duty. Each word felt like a chain, binding us both tighter to this endless cycle. When I immersed the figure briefly, a guttural cry tore from their throat, raw and inhuman, echoing off the chapel walls like a scream trapped between worlds. Their body jerked violently, muscles straining as though fighting against unseen shackles. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and danced on the cracked stone walls. Their eyes blazed with a terrible light, a storm of fury, sorrow, and something primal that froze me in place. With trembling hands, I finished the ritual, my voice breaking under the weight of a desperate plea. I begged whatever force governed this cursed place to accept the soul and contain the darkness threatening to break free. But deep inside, I knew this was no salvation. It was a sentence, a chain, another link forged in an unbreakable torment. As the water stilled and the figure sagged, hollow and drained, the silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. Faint, jagged symbols glowed softly on their pale skin, the final mark of the damned. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, knowing again that I was the priest who baptizes the damned, forever trapped in this endless ritual. The chapel settled back into its heavy silence, but this silence was different, thicker, almost suffocating. The acrid scent of burnt wax and something darker lingered in the air, a lingering reminder of the torment I had just bound once again. I stood by the baptismal font, my hands gripping the cold stone edge, the tremor in my fingers betraying the storm of emotions I struggled to contain. The figure I had baptized earlier now sat slumped against the cold wall, their breath shallow and uneven. Their eyes, once flickering with a desperate hope, were now vacant and distant. Beneath that hollow gaze I sensed a restless turmoil, an anguish no blessing could soothe. It was a tempest trapped within a fragile shell, bound by a ritual that offered no salvation. I turned away, unable to watch their silent suffering any longer, but the weight of their torment clung to me like a shadow that refused to fade. The faces of the damned haunted my mind, their hollow eyes, their silent screams, and the chains I forged with every baptism. This suffering was no longer theirs alone. It was etched deep into my soul, a permanent wound I carried in silence. Doubt gnawed relentlessly at my mind. Was this ritual truly sacred, or a cruel curse masquerading as mercy? Each baptism was another link in an unbreakable chain of torment, and I was the one forging those links. The chapel's flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the walls, distorting the ancient symbols into sinister shapes that seemed to leer and whisper just beyond my sight. The faint glow of the etched markings pulsed softly, a grim reminder that this place was not just a church, but a living prison, one that held not only the damned, but me as well. The crushing weight of this truth threatened to break me, and I sank onto a cold wooden pew, exhaustion washing over me like a dark wave. Memories of the damned flooded my thoughts, their silent pleas, the unbearable weight of their suffering. Faith, once my refuge, now felt fragile and hollow. The prayers I muttered echoed in a void of despair. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the meaning of mercy, and whether I was truly a servant of light or merely a warden of darkness. Sleep offered no solace. Nightmares plagued my rest, twisted faces, anguished cries, and endless processions of trapped souls. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the crushing burden of this cursed church pressing down on me even in the dark. Yet despite the despair, the cycle continues. The ritual never ends. The suffering never ceases, and I remain, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The chapel greets me with a silence so thick it feels almost suffocating. The first light of dawn seeps through the stained glass, casting fractured shards of cold, muted color on the ancient stone floor. Outside, the wind moans through the skeletal branches of the gnarled trees, their brittle limbs scratching at the mist like desperate fingers searching for release. Inside, the heavy stillness is broken only by the faint drip of water echoing somewhere beneath the floorboards, a slow, irregular rhythm that matches the uneasy beating of my heart. I sit by the altar, hands resting on the rough wood, fingertips tracing the faded carvings etched into its surface by hands long gone. The weight of countless prayers, curses, and silent screams presses down on me like an invisible shroud. The ancient Bible lies open before me, its fragile pages trembling with age, yet the words blur and twist before my weary eyes, lost amid the fog of exhaustion and creeping dread. The baptismal font stands at the center of the chapel, its water unnervingly still and dark, mirroring the flickering candlelight like a pool of black glare. I hesitate, reaching out to touch the cold water's surface. The chill bites deep, crawling beneath my skin and settling in my bones. This water is no ordinary element. It carries the sorrow and torment of every soul bound by this cursed ritual, every whispered curse and unanswered prayer. It is a wellspring of despair, and I am its unwilling keeper. My robes cling heavy and suffocating, soaked in the lingering weight of those I have baptized. Their faces haunt the recesses of my mind, their hollow eyes, their silent screams, and the unbreakable chains I have forged around them. Every arrival renews the cycle, tightening the bonds, dragging me further into darkness. The candlelight flickers, casting grotesque shadows that writhe and twist across the stone walls. The ancient symbols carved into the surface seem alive, leering just beyond my vision, whispering secrets that chill my soul. The air is thick with the mingled scents of burning wax, damp stone, and an acrid tang, like smoldering ash, an invisible stain left by countless rituals before mine. A distant bell tolls, its mournful chime reverberating through the fog outside and the oppressive silence within. It signals the inevitable, the next soul destined to cross this threshold, to be baptized not into salvation, but into chains. I rise slowly, the weight of the day settling like a shroud upon my shoulders. The ritual tools lie ready, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I brace myself for what must come. The chapel waits. I wait. The cycle begins anew. The chapel door groaned open, a slow, haunting sound that shattered the uneasy stillness. A figure appeared in the dim light, thin, trembling, cloaked in threadbare rags soaked through with the cold mist that clung stubbornly to the morning air. Their eyes were wide and haunted, flickering with a desperate hope I knew I could not grant. No words were spoken between us. The weight of what was about to unfold pressed down like a crushing force, tightening around my chest until my breath came shallow and uneven. I stepped aside, silently beckoning the soul inside. As they crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to plummet further, the shadows deepening and swallowing the flickering candlelight whole. I led the figure toward the baptismal font, its water unnervingly still, reflecting the wavering flames and the hollow eyes that stared back from the depths. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth mingled with something acrid, like smoldering ash and burnt flesh, a bitter residue left behind by countless rituals before this one. The prayers slipped from my lips, spoken not with faith but with the heavy weight of obligation. Each word felt like another chain, binding us both tighter to this endless cycle. When I submerged the figure briefly in the cold water, a guttural cry erupted from their throat, raw, inhuman, and filled with a pain that echoed through the stone walls and reverberated deep within my chest. Their body convulsed violently, muscles twisting as if struggling against unseen shackles. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and danced on the cracked walls like restless phantoms. Their eyes burned with a terrible light, a tempest of fury, sorrow, and something primal that froze me in place. With trembling hands, I pressed on with the final words of the ritual, my voice breaking under the strain of a desperate plea. I begged whatever dark power ruled this cursed place to accept the soul and contain the darkness threatening to spill free. But deep inside, I knew the bitter truth. This was no salvation. It was a binding, a curse, another link forged in an unbreakable chain of torment. As the water stilled and the figure sagged, hollow and drained, the chapel fell into an oppressive silence, heavier and more suffocating than before. Jagged symbols glowed faintly on their pale skin, the final mark of the damned. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding, knowing once again that I was the priest who baptizes the damned, trapped forever in this never-ending ritual. The chapel returned to its oppressive silence, but the stillness felt heavier this time, thicker, as if it pressed against my very lungs. The acrid scent of burnt wax lingered, mingling with the faint trace of something darker, an invisible stain left by the suffering I had just bound anew. I stood by the baptismal font, my hands gripping the cold, unforgiving stone edge, the slight tremor betraying the turmoil roiling inside me. The figure I baptized earlier slumped against the cold wall, empty and hollow. Their breath was shallow, uneven, yet beneath that vacant gaze I sensed a restless storm, a torment no blessing could quell. It was a tempest trapped inside fragile flesh, bound by a ritual that offered no salvation. I turned away, unable to watch their silent suffering any longer, but their torment clung to me like a shadow that refused to fade. The faces of the damned haunted my mind, their hollow eyes, their voiceless screams, and the chains I forged with every baptism. This suffering was no longer theirs alone. It was etched deep into my soul, a permanent scar I bore in silence. Doubt gnawed at me relentlessly. Was this ritual truly sacred, or a cruel curse masquerading as mercy? Each baptism was another link in an unbreakable chain of torment, and I was the blacksmith forging those bonds. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the chapel walls, distorting the ancient symbols into sinister shapes that seemed to leer and whisper just beyond my sight. The faint glow of etched markings pulsed softly, a grim reminder that this place was no mere church but a living prison, one that held not only the damned but me as well. The crushing weight of this truth threatened to break me, and I sank onto a cold wooden pew, exhaustion washing over me like a dark wave. Memories flooded my mind, the silent pleas of the damned, the unbearable weight of their suffering. Faith, once my refuge, now felt fragile and hollow. The prayers I muttered echoed in a void of despair. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the meaning of mercy, and whether I was truly a servant of light or merely a warden of darkness. Sleep brought no relief. Nightmares invaded my rest, twisted faces, anguished cries, endless processions of trapped souls. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the crushing burden of this cursed chapel pressing down even in the dark. Yet despite the despair, the cycle continues. The ritual never ends, the suffering never ceases, and I remain, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The chill in the chapel is relentless today. Even as dawn attempts to bleed through the stained glass, the colors it casts are muted and cold, fractured by the heavy shadows clinging to the stone walls. Outside, the wind bites sharply through the skeletal trees, their branches scraping at the fog like desperate fingers scratching for escape. Inside, the silence presses on me, thick and suffocating, broken only by the distant drip of water somewhere beneath the floor, steady, slow, and unnerving. I sit before the altar, fingers tracing the worn carvings on the ancient wood, their edges softened by centuries of use and prayer. The weight of countless souls, lost, damned, and forgotten, settles over me like a shroud. The Bible lies open but unread. The words blur as exhaustion and dread cloud my mind, slipping away beneath the reeds. Lentless fog of this cursed place. The baptismal font stands at the heart of the chapel, its water unnervingly still and black, reflecting the trembling candle flames. I hesitate, my hand hovering just above the surface before the cold finally sinks in, creeping deep into my bones. This is no ordinary water. It carries the weight of every soul bound by this unholy ritual, every whispered curse and unanswered prayer. It is a pool of despair, and I am its unwilling guardian. My robes feel heavier today, soaked with the sorrow of those I have baptized. Their faces haunt me, their hollow eyes, their silent screams, the chains I have forged with every baptism. Each new arrival tightens the cycle, dragging me deeper into darkness. The candlelight flickers, casting grotesque shadows that twist and writhe along the cracked stone walls. The ancient symbols carved into the stone seem to leer just beyond my sight, whispering secrets I cannot fully understand. The air is thick with the mingled scents of burning wax, damp stone, and a bitter acridness, like smoldering ash left behind by countless ceremonies before mine. A distant bell tolls, low and mournful, its sound echoing through the fog and settling heavily in the chapel's oppressive silence. It marks the inevitable, the arrival of the next soul destined for baptism, not into grace, but chains. I rise slowly, the weight of this endless day pressing down on me. The ritual tools lie ready, faintly gleaming in the dim light. I steel myself. The chapel waits. I wait. The cycle begins anew. The chapel door opened with a slow, reluctant creak, disturbing the heavy silence that had settled like a thick fog over the ancient stones. A figure stepped inside, thin and trembling, cloaked in tattered garments soaked through by the cold, damp mist clinging stubbornly outside. Their eyes, wide and haunted, flickered with a desperate hope to us. That made my chest tighten in pain, a hope I knew I could not fulfill. No words passed between us. The oppressive weight of the moment pressed down, squeezing the air from my lungs until each breath came shallow and uneven. I stepped aside, silently beckoning the soul into the chapel's unforgiving embrace. As they crossed the threshold, the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the flickering candlelight whole, as if the darkness itself sought to consume this cursed moment. Guiding them toward the baptismal font, I could feel the familiar chill seep through my gloves as my fingers brushed the cold stone rim. The water's surface shimmered with a dark, oily sheen, reflecting the wavering flames and the hollow eyes staring back from its depths. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth mixed with an acrid tang, like smoldering ash and burnt flesh, a bitter reminder of the countless rituals performed here before mine. The prayers slipped from my lips, not with faith, but out of solemn duty. Each word felt like a chain tightening around my own spirit, binding us both to this unending cycle. When I submerged the figure briefly, a guttural cry erupted from their throat, raw, inhuman, a sound filled with agony that echoed off the chapel walls and reverberated deep within my chest. Their body convulsed violently, muscles twisting as though fighting invisible shackles. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and danced on the cracked walls like restless phantoms. Their eyes blazed with a terrible, otherworldly light, a tempest of fury, sorrow, and primal anguish that rooted me to the spot. With trembling hands, I pressed on with the final words of the ritual, my voice breaking under the weight of desperate pleading. I begged whatever dark force held sway in this place to accept the soul and contain the darkness threatening to burst free. But deep inside, I knew the bitter truth. This was no salvation. It was a curse, a sentence, another link forged in the endless chain of suffering. As the water stilled and the figure sagged, hollow and drained, the oppressive silence returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. Jagged symbols glowed faintly on their pale skin, the final mark of the damned. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, knowing once again that I was the priest who baptizes the damned, trapped forever in this relentless ritual. The chapel slipped back into its oppressive silence, but this silence was heavier than before, thicker, almost tangible, pressing against my very lungs. The acrid scent of burnt wax lingered in the air, mingling with the faint trace of something darker, an invisible stain left by the torment I had just bound once again. I stood beside the baptismal font, my hands gripping the cold, unyielding stone edge, the subtle tremor betraying the turmoil churning within me. The figure I baptized earlier now slumped against the cold stone wall, empty and hollow. Their breath came shallow and uneven, but behind the vacant gaze, I sensed a restless storm, a torment no blessing could quell. It was a tempest trapped in fragile flesh, chained by a ritual that offered no salvation. I turned away, unable to bear their silent suffering any longer, but the weight of their anguish clung to me like a shadow refusing to fade. The faces of the damned haunted my mind, their hollow eyes, their voiceless screams, the chains I forged with every baptism. This torment was no longer theirs alone. It was etched deeply into my soul, a permanent scar I carried in silence. Doubt gnawed relentlessly at my mind. Was this ritual truly sacred, or a cruel curse masquerading as mercy? Each baptism was another link forged in an unbreakable chain of torment, and I was the blacksmith binding those bonds. The flickering candlelight cast grotesque shadows on the chapel walls, twisting the ancient symbols into sinister shapes that seemed to leer and whisper just beyond my sight. The faint glow of the etched markings pulsed softly, a grim reminder that this place was no mere church, but a living prison, one that held not only the damned, but me as well. The crushing weight of this truth threatened to break me, and I sank onto a cold wooden pew, exhaustion washing over me like a dark tide. Memories of the damned flooded my mind, their silent pleas, the unbearable weight of their suffering. Faith, once my refuge, now felt fragile and hollow. The prayers I muttered echoed in a void of despair. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the meaning of mercy, and whether I was truly a servant of light or merely a warden of darkness. Sleep brought no relief. Nightmares invaded my rest, twisted faces, anguished cries, endless processions of trapped souls. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the crushing burden of this cursed chapel pressing down even in the dark. Yet despite the despair, the cycle continues. The ritual never ends, the suffering never ceases, and I remain, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The chapel feels colder than ever this morning, as if the very stones have absorbed more despair overnight. Dawn filters weakly through the stained glass, casting fractured, muted hues across the cold floor. Outside, the wind rattles the bare branches of the ancient trees, their skeletal fingers scratching at the mist like desperate hands searching for release. Inside, the silence is dense and suffocating, broken only by the faint drip of water echoing somewhere beneath the floorboards. A slow, irregular rhythm that mirrors the uneasy beating of my heart. I sit near the altar, fingers tracing the worn carvings etched into the wood by generations long past. The weight of countless prayers, curses, and silent screams hangs over me like a heavy shroud. The ancient Bible lies open before me, its fragile pages trembling with age, but the words blur and twist before my tired eyes, lost amid the creeping fog of dread and exhaustion. The baptismal font occupies the center of the chapel, its water unnervingly still and dark, reflecting the flickering candlelight like a pool of black glass. I reach out tentatively, feeling the chill bite into my skin and settle deep in my bones. This water is no ordinary element. It carries the sorrow and torment of every soul bound by this cursed ritual. Every whispered curse, every unanswered prayer. It is a well of despair, and I am its reluctant guardian. My robes cling heavy and suffocating, soaked with the weight of those I have baptized. Their faces haunt my mind, the hollow eyes, the silent screams, the chains I have forged with every ritual. Each arrival renews the cycle, tightening the bonds and dragging me further into darkness. The candlelight flickers, casting grotesque shadows that twist and writhe across the cracked stone walls. The ancient symbols carved into the surface seem to leer just beyond my vision, whispering secrets that chill my soul. The air is thick with the mingled scents of burning wax, damp stone, and an acrid tang, like smoldering ash, a bitter reminder left behind by countless ceremonies before mine. A distant bell tolls, low and mournful, its sound echoing through the fog outside and settling heavily in the oppressive silence within. It marks the inevitable, the arrival of the next soul destined to cross this threshold, to be baptized not into salvation, but into chains. I rise slowly, the weight of the day settling heavily on my shoulders. The ritual tools lie ready, gleaming faintly in the dim light. I steel myself for what must come. The chapel waits, I wait. The cycle begins anew. The chapel door creaked open with a slow, reluctant groan that shattered the heavy silence. A figure stepped inside, thin, gaunt, cloaked in damp clothes that smelled of earth and cold mist. Their eyes were wide and haunted, flickering with a desperate hope I knew I could not fulfill. No words passed between us. The crushing weight of what was about to unfold pressed down like a vice around my chest, constricting my breath until each inhale was shallow and uneven. I stepped aside, silently beckoning the soul inside. As they crossed the threshold, the air seemed to grow colder, shadows deepening until they threatened to swallow the flickering candlelight whole. I guided them toward the baptismal font, its water unnervingly still and dark, reflecting the wavering flames and the hollow eyes that stared back from its depths. The air was thick with the scent of damp stone and something acrid, like smoldering ash and burnt flesh, a bitter residue left by countless rituals before this one. The prayers slipped from my lips, not with faith but with solemn duty. Each word felt like a chain tightening around my own spirit, binding us both to this endless cycle. When I submerged the figure briefly, a guttural cry tore from their throat. Raw, inhuman, a sound filled with agony that echoed through the stone walls and reverberated deep within me. Their body convulsed violently, muscles twisting as if fighting unseen shackles. The candle flames flickered wildly, casting grotesque shadows that writhed and danced on the cracked walls like restless phantoms. Their eyes burned with a terrible light, a tempest of fury, sorrow, and something primal that rooted me to the spot. With trembling hands, I pressed on with the final words of the ritual, my voice breaking under the weight of desperate pleading. I begged whatever dark force governed this cursed place to accept the soul and contain the darkness threatening to spill free. But deep inside, I knew the bitter truth. This was no salvation. It was a curse, a sentence, another link forged in an unbreakable chain of torment. As the water stilled and the figure sagged, hollow and drained, the chapel fell into an oppressive silence, heavier and more suffocating than before. Jagged symbols glowed faintly on their pale skin, the final mark of the damned. I swallowed hard, heart pounding, knowing once again that I was the priest who baptizes the damned, trapped forever in this endless ritual. The chapel's silence returned after the ritual, but it was no longer just silence. It was a dense, suffocating weight that pressed down on my chest and seemed to cling to the very air I breathed. The faint scent of burnt wax lingered in the dim corners, tangled with an almost intangible bitterness, like smoke from a fire no one could see. I stood near the baptismal font, my hands gripping the cold, unyielding stone as if it might ground me in the madness. But the tremor in my fingers betrayed the turmoil roiling inside. The figure I had baptized earlier now sat slumped against the cold stone wall. Their breathing was shallow and uneven, ragged like the last gasps of a dying flame. Their eyes, those hollow, haunted eyes, no longer held the desperate flicker of hope I had seen when they first crossed the threshold. Instead, they stared blankly into a distance I could not reach, a void of torment locked inside fragile flesh. The ritual had chained them tighter, but it was no salvation. It was a prison. I couldn't bear to watch the silent suffering any longer. I turned away, but their pain clung to me like a shadow that refused to fade. The faces of the damned haunted my thoughts, their hollow eyes, their voiceless screams, the endless chains I had forged with every baptism. This torment was no longer theirs alone. It had become part of me, etched into my soul like a scar I could never heal. Doubt gnawed relentlessly at the edges of my mind. Was this ritual truly a sacred rite or merely a cruel curse masquerading as mercy? Every baptism felt like another link forged in an unbreakable chain of torment, and I was the blacksmith hammering the iron. The flickering candlelight threw grotesque shadows against the chapel walls, twisting the ancient symbols carved into stone into sinister shapes that seemed to leer and whisper just beyond my sight. A faint glow pulsed softly from the jagged markings etched into the damned soul's skin, a grim reminder that this place was no ordinary church but a living prison. It held not only the damned but me, its unwilling warden. The crushing weight of this truth threatened to break me, and I sank onto a cold wooden pew, exhaustion washing over me like a dark tide. Memories flooded my mind, the silent pleas of the damned, the unbearable burden of their suffering. Faith, once my refuge, now felt fragile and hollow. The prayers I muttered echoed into a void of despair. I questioned everything, the sanctity of the ritual, the meaning of mercy, and whether I was truly a servant of light or merely a warden of darkness. Sleep offered no relief. Nightmares invaded my rest, twisted faces, anguished cries, endless processions of trapped souls. I awoke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the crushing burden of this cursed chapel pressing down on me even in the darkness. Yet despite the despair, the cycle continues. The ritual never ends, the suffering never ceases, and I remain, trapped, bound, the priest who baptizes the damned. The first frost of the season had arrived overnight, glazing the monastery grounds in a brittle silver sheen. When I stepped outside at dawn, the crunch beneath my boots echoed far louder than it should have in the still morning air, as though the land itself resented being disturbed. The sky was a dull tear, heavy with clouds that seemed unwilling to move, trapping the world beneath a dim, muted light. From where I stood on the chapel steps, the cemetery stretched before me in neat, oppressive rows. The frost made every headstone appear sharper, harsher, as if the cold had carved the names deeper into the stone. The wrought iron gate at the far end was closed, its bars laced with thin ice that caught the light like strands of glass. Somewhere beyond that gate, a forest stood silent and watchful, its skeletal trees bare and black against the horizon. Inside the chapel, the air was warmer but no less heavy. The faint scent of incense lingered, stubbornly clinging to the wooden beams, though I hadn't lit any in days. The single candle I had allowed to burn overnight was reduced to a crooked stub, its wax pooled and hardened like congealed blood. I ran my fingers along the edge of the pews, feeling the grooves worn smooth by generations of hands that had sought comfort here, and failed to find it. I heard the bell in the east tower toll once. Just once. It wasn't the hour. It wasn't any call I had made. The sound rolled through the chapel like a cold breath, rattling the stained glass windows in their frames. My stomach tightened. That single note had a weight to it, a significance that was not mine to define. It was on mornings like this, cold, colorless, and stripped bare, that I felt the monastery most alive. Not alive in the way of growing things, but alive the way a patient is on the edge of death, aware, listening, and holding its breath. Every creak in the timber, every faint rustle in the stone corridors, felt deliberate, almost sentient. And yet, despite the oppressive stillness, there was a pull, a quiet but relentless summons to prepare the font once more. A new arrival would come before nightfall. I did not know how I knew this, but I had stopped questioning such instincts long ago. The frost outside would not melt today. The bell would not ring again. But the chapel would have a guest, and the ritual would go on. By mid-afternoon, the frost had deepened instead of fading. The air bit at my skin, sharp and clean, but carrying with it a scent I couldn't place, something metallic, faint, and almost sweet. I was in the chapel, polishing the rim of the baptismal font, when I heard the first sound, a slow, deliberate knock on the wooden doors. Not the hurried pounding of someone in need, but a measured, almost ceremonial rhythm. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. I hesitated. The last time I had heard that exact pattern, it had not been a person waiting on the other side. The doors creaked open without my touch, revealing a figure swaddled in a tattered, hooded cloak that brushed the frost from the stone floor. Their head was bowed, the hood casting their face in shadow, but their hands, thin, pale, and trembling, were clasped tightly together as if holding something small. They stepped inside with a slow, mechanical grace, never lifting their head. The door swung shut behind them with a sound that seemed far too final. My breath clouded in the cold air that followed them in, and for a moment I could almost see the frost crawl over the wooden planks beneath their feet. "You've been expected," I said quietly, my voice sounding alien to my own ears. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they extended their hands toward me. Nestled in their palms was a small, carved wooden icon, a crude depiction of an angel but with no eyes. The wings were splintered, as though something had tried to tear them away. I took it without thinking, but the instant my fingers closed around it, I felt the chill. Not the clean winter kind, but something older, the cold of places deep underground where sunlight never reaches. My heartbeat faltered, a strange weight pressing against my chest as though I were being submerged in icy water. Without speaking, I led them to the font. The ritual was supposed to be simple: water poured over the bowed head, a prayer murmured in Latin, a cleansing. But as the water flowed, it refused to drip from their hair. It clung to them instead, sliding upward against gravity, before vanishing into the air in thin tendrils of mist. When I looked into their face for the first time, the hood having slipped back slightly, I saw eyes that were not eyes at all. 2 pits of darkness that swallowed the candlelight whole. My prayer caught in my throat, and yet I could not stop. The bell had tolled. The guest had come. The ritual would go on. When the final Latin word left my lips, the air in the chapel shifted. It wasn't a breeze, there was no movement, but a pressure like the weight of unseen hands pressing down on my shoulders. The cloaked figure did not move, but the water in the font had gone black, reflecting nothing at all, as though the stone basin now held a piece of the night sky. I took a step back, but my feet felt heavy, almost as though the frost had crept up my legs and locked me to the floor. The carved angel in my palm had changed, the wood now damp, the eyeless face warped as if it had been burned from within. The figure finally raised its head fully. The dark pits where its eyes should have been seemed deeper now, and for the first time I sensed movement within them, like something far away swimming toward the surface. My instincts screamed to run, but my role as groundskeeper bound me, and then it spoke. Its voice wasn't one voice, but many, layered and discordant, speaking in a language I did not know but somehow understood. It told me that the ritual was incomplete, that the angel without eyes had not yet seen the truth, and that the monastery's oldest doors, the ones sealed centuries ago, would soon open again. The moment it finished, the black water in the font began to swirl violently. The candle flames in the chapel bent toward it, as if drawn by an unseen current. Then, without warning, the figure collapsed into the water, disappearing entirely. Not a splash, not a ripple, only the silence that followed, a silence that seemed to press into my ears until I could hear my own heartbeat thundering. I staggered back, the icon still in my hand, and watched as the water slowly regained its normal clarity. The temperature in the chapel rose ever so slightly, and for a brief moment I could almost believe nothing had happened at all. Almost. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my small quarters, the eyeless angel placed on the table before me. I kept expecting it to move or to whisper, but it did nothing, and yet I could feel it watching me, not with eyes, but with presence. In the quiet, I thought about what the figure had said, about the old doors. I had passed them countless times, massive slabs of oak reinforced with rusted iron, carved with symbols I had never been able to decipher. The abbot always told me they were just relics of a forgotten era, and never to be opened. But now, I knew the truth. The guest who had come was only the beginning. The monastery was no longer sealed, and in the hollow hours before dawn I realized with a kind of cold certainty that the next time the knocking came, it would be louder. I placed the eyeless angel back into the font, hoping, foolishly, that returning it would undo what I had done. It didn't. As I turned to leave, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. The great oak doors at the far end of the monastery, the ones sealed for centuries, they were open, and from the darkness beyond something was breathing.